By the spring of 1945, the Third Army had become something close to unstoppable. Since the breakout from Normandy the previous summer, General George S. Patton's forces had swept more than 250 miles across France, punched through Belgium, crashed through the Siegfried Line, and crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd. A crossing so sudden, so lightly opposed, that Patton initially kept it secret. He had beaten his British rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, across the last great natural barrier into Germany, and he had done it without fanfare, without elaborate staging, without the massive preliminary bombardment Montgomery would use the following night. When he was ready to announce it, he called Omar Bradley and said to tell the world. Third Army was inside Germany. Through late March and into early April, 12th Corps and 20th Corps drove east into the German heartland, through Thuringia, through towns and crossroads that were falling faster than maps could be updated. The Wehrmacht was fragmenting. Surrender was happening in columns, in batches, entire units coming off roads with hands raised. For the soldiers of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division leading the advance, the war had the feeling of a chase rather than a battle. The enemy was still dangerous. Scattered pockets of SS resistance, demolished bridges, minefields on the roads. But the momentum was undeniably allied, undeniably forward, undeniably toward an end that everyone could now feel approaching. No one had told them what lay south of Gotha. No Allied military map marked it. No intelligence briefing had mentioned it. No orders from Supreme Headquarters had prepared any division, any commander, any private soldier for what existed off those maps. On the morning of April 4th, 1945, units of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division entered a camp near the town of Ohrdruf. It was, in the bureaucratic language of the Nazi state, a forced labor subcamp, a satellite of the larger Buchenwald concentration camp system, established in November 1944 to supply labor for the construction of underground communications tunnels near Mühlberg Castle. Prisoners had been forced to dig through nearby mountains to connect the castle to a railway line. The work had been driven by starvation rations, exhaustion, and execution. When the SS guards had understood that American armor was closing from the west, they had fled. Some had tried to disguise themselves. Others had killed the prisoners who could not walk before they left. What the soldiers found was beyond the language they had been given for war. Piles of bodies, some covered with lime, others partially incinerated on pyres, mass graves, gallows, surviving prisoners who were skeletal, barely upright, unable to comprehend what was happening around them. The 4th Armored Division had fought through France, through the snow at Bastogne, through the Siegfried Line. Nothing had prepared any of them for Ohrdruf. Accounts differ on what happened to SS guards who were identified by surviving prisoners in the immediate aftermath. Some sources suggest Allied soldiers shot them on the spot, while others indicate some guards had already been killed by prisoners before the Americans arrived. What is not debated is the scale of what was discovered, or the fact that it was only the beginning. Ohrdruf was a subcamp. The main camp was 30 miles to the east. This is the battle most people have never seen on a map. Not the crossing of the Rhine, not the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, not the race toward the Czech border, but the second campaign that began on April 4th, 1945, when Patton's army walked into something that had no military precedent. The enemy in this battle wore no uniform. The front line was a gate, and the weapon that would matter most was not armor, not artillery, not air power. It was the documented, undeniable, photographed and filmed and witnessed truth of what had happened inside the camps of the Third Reich. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what the world outside the camps had been allowed to believe. American newspapers had reported on Nazi atrocities since 1933. The persecution of Jewish people, the existence of camps, the broad machinery of Nazi brutality. These were not secrets buried in classified files. They had appeared in print, in newsreels, in diplomatic cables. Journalists had written about them. Politicians had read the dispatches. And yet, despite 12 years of reporting, no Allied command had issued training protocols for discovering a concentration camp. No unit had been briefed on what to do. No medical teams had been pre-positioned. No chain of command existed for this kind of discovery, because no one in the planning apparatus had built one. The assumption, embedded in every level of the military and civilian structure, was that whatever was happening inside Germany could be roughly understood from what had been published. The reports existed. The warnings existed. The assumption was that reading about something was the same as knowing it. The reality, it turned out, could not be communicated by anything that had been printed, because the gap between what words could carry and what existed inside those fences was not a matter of degree. It was a different order of experience entirely. Eisenhower would write to Winston Churchill that everything printed about the camps does not adequately describe what has really happened here. That line, written after he had seen Ohrdruf with his own eyes, is the measure of that gap, not an exaggeration, not rhetoric designed for a statesman's letter, a precise report from a man who had spent his career learning to read situations without illusion, and who was now confronting something that broke every frame he had carried into the war. The gap between what the world thought it knew and what actually existed inside those fences was enormous, and Patton's army had just fallen into it. On April 6th, 2 days after the discovery, Colonel Hayden Sears, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, ordered prominent citizens of the town of Ohrdruf to tour the camp. The town sat within sight and smell of what had been happening there. The response from the German civilians was the same response that would be heard at camp after camp as Allied forces moved deeper into Germany. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We did not know. The phrase enraged many American soldiers. The smell alone had reached the town. The forced labor columns had moved through roads the townspeople used. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife were ordered to make the tour. They were found dead the following morning in what appeared to be a suicide. A note reportedly left nearby read, "We didn't know, but we knew." The exact wording of the note is difficult to independently verify across sources, but the incident and what it revealed about the relationship between German civilian life and the camps was noted by multiple witnesses and would be cited in the days that followed. What Sears had done informally at Ohrdruf, Eisenhower would turn into policy, but that decision came 8 days later, and in between, the evidence kept accumulating. On April 11, 1945, American forces reached Buchenwald. The main camp sat on a hill outside Weimar, a city that had once represented the cultural heart of Germany, home to Goethe, Schiller, the Bauhaus. The distance between the Germany that Weimar represented and what had been built on the hill above it was the distance the whole war had been trying to close. Between 1937 and 1945, the Nazis had imprisoned at least 250,000 people at Buchenwald from across Europe. The SS had murdered at least 56,000 of them, among them at least 11,000 Jews. When American soldiers arrived, they found conditions that made Ohrdruf, itself almost beyond description, look like a preview of something larger and more systematic than anyone had yet fully understood. Among the prisoners found alive at Buchenwald was a young man named Elie Wiesel, who would later write in his memoir about what survival inside that system had cost and what it meant to be present at the moment it ended. His account, and the accounts of thousands of survivors like him, would become part of the historical record that Eisenhower was already, at that very moment, beginning to build. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower flew to Ohrdruf. He arrived with Generals Patton and Omar Bradley. A survivor of the camp led them through it, with a U.S. military translator. The camp was still filled with the evidence of what had happened there: bodies of prisoners murdered before the SS fled, the physical machinery of a system designed to extract labor until death and then erase the evidence. Eisenhower reportedly said he had never been so angry in his life that the English language did not contain words adequate to describe what he was seeing. Bradley wept openly. Several senior officers around them did the same. Patton, the general who had stood in front of his troops and delivered speeches that made hardened soldiers laugh and cheer, the commander who had pushed through France at a pace no one else matched, who had relieved himself theatrically in the Rhine on camera, went to a corner of Ohrdruf and was physically sick. He refused to enter one room where bodies had been stacked. Robert D. Murphy, diplomat and senior political advisor to Eisenhower, who was present that day, recorded it directly. The reactions described in multiple accounts are sourced from memoirs and diplomatic testimony. They represent reported observations, not reconstructed scenes. But what Eisenhower did in the hours and days following the tour is documented fact, and it is where the second campaign truly began. Eisenhower cabled General George C. Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. His words were precise and deliberate. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. He did not use those words to describe weakness. He used them to begin a campaign of documentation, unlike anything the Allied command had previously attempted. He ordered the U.S. Army Signal Corps to photograph and film Ohrdruf and every camp that followed, systematically, comprehensively. He ordered every available American soldier in the surrounding areas to tour the camps, not as an option, not as a recommendation, but as a direct military order. Soldiers who had just fought their way across a continent, who had survived the bulge in the Rhine and the rubble of German towns, were ordered to walk through the camps and see what the war had been fought against. He ordered local German civilians to see what had been done in their names. He ordered Nazi Party leaders and local office holders to be brought to the camps and required to walk through them. And he sent a request to Washington. Send members of Congress, send newspaper editors and publishers, bring witnesses who could not later be dismissed, whose credibility could not later be questioned, whose presence in front of the evidence could not be explained away. The reasoning was explicit. Eisenhower understood with the clarity of a man who had spent years studying how information shapes strategic outcomes, that the physical evidence in front of him would one day be denied by people who had not seen it. He was thinking past the victory celebration. He was thinking past the surrender documents and the flags and the headlines. He stated it plainly. He wanted the evidence placed before the American and British publics in a way that would leave no room for what he called cynical doubt. That phrase, cynical doubt, was not abstract. It was a prediction. He was anticipating, in April 1945, the argument that would be made in the years and decades that followed by people who had not been there and would claim that what had been there could not have been real. By late April, exactly as Eisenhower had requested, 12 members of the United States Congress arrived in Germany and toured the camps. 6 newspaper and magazine editors and publishers traveled with them. Every one of them was described afterward as horrified. The accounts they brought back to the United States were not the accounts of distant witnesses reading reports. They were the accounts of men who had stood inside the camps, who had seen the mass graves and the emaciated survivors, and the physical evidence of what a modern industrial state had done to millions of human beings over 12 years. Those accounts ran in American newspapers. They were read in Congress. They could not be dismissed as rumor, as exaggeration, or as wartime propaganda, because the men reporting them were the editors and lawmakers whose entire professional identity rested on the credibility of what they put their names to. Eisenhower's documentation campaign had found its first major results, but the campaign itself had only begun. Before April ended, Allied forces had liberated Dora-Mittelbau, Dachau, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, Sachsenhausen, Flossenburg, and Ravensbrück. Not one of these camps had appeared on any Allied military map. Not one had been anticipated in any operational plan. The Third Army, the First Army, the British and Canadian forces advancing from the north. They had all been driving toward the defeat of the Wehrmacht, the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial pocket, the capture of German territory. What they found, repeatedly, as they pushed into the German interior, was a parallel geography that the war's military maps had never shown. A second country, hidden inside the first, built from wire and guard towers and railway sidings that led to places the official maps left blank. Patton was promoted to full general, 4 stars, in April 1945, in recognition of the Third Army's campaign across Western Europe. His forces continued east toward the Czech border as the German state collapsed entirely around them. On May 8, 1945, VE Day was declared. The war in Europe was over. The photographs taken by the Signal Corps, the film footage, the congressional testimony, the reports filed by the editors and publishers who had toured the camps, all of it would become foundational evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The pattern Eisenhower had established at Ohrdruf, the forced confrontation between physical reality and the claim of ignorance, repeated itself across Germany until the claim itself became untenable. The evidence had been placed before the world in a way designed to leave no room for doubt, and it was the deliberate, strategic decision of a supreme commander who understood that some battles are fought with records, not rifles. Patton died on December 21, 1945, from injuries sustained in a road accident near Mannheim. He had been back in Germany less than 2 weeks when the accident occurred. He never saw the Nuremberg verdicts. He never saw the full weight of what his army had uncovered settle into the historical record. The man who had raced across France, forced the Rhine before anyone expected it, and led the army that stumbled into the first American-liberated Nazi camp, died before the world finished reckoning with what that discovery meant. The Third Army's arc on a map runs from the beaches of Normandy through the fields of France, east through Belgium, across the Rhine at Oppenheim, and into the heart of Thuringia. That line tells one story, a story of speed, of armor, of a commander who pushed harder and faster than anyone thought was possible. But south of Gotha, off every map the Allies were using, another story had been waiting to be found. The war on the map was one thing. What existed off the map was something the language of war had never been built to describe. What Patton found inside those camps was not a military objective. It was evidence of what the war had actually been against, and why, in the words Eisenhower chose carefully when he ordered the cameras in, the world had to see it without the possibility of doubt.